Hey friends, it's Lauren. Thank you so much for joining me back in my craft room for a Pretty Pink Posh video. And I'm excited to share with you a fun fall themed card. I'm using the brand new fall jar stamp set and coordinating dies, and I'm going to be mixing it with a slightly older product called the Autumn Wreath and its coordinating dies. And we're using my new favorite single stencil ever, the Deco leaves. I love this stencil for fall, but honestly, it's perfect for any time of the year. It's such a great diverse stencil, and you absolutely need to have it in your stash. I'm putting my grip mat onto my glass mat so I can do some stenciling, because if you've seen any of my videos before, I like to do my stenciling first as I tend to grab my stencil paste, and our background definitely needs time to dry. So I am applying down my stencil. This is a wood grain panel that I trimmed down to 4 by 5 1/4, and I'm going to start with ink blending. I'm using ground espresso distress ink and a little blending brush to add that color through the stencil, completely covering my little panel of wood grain cardstock. The stencil paste I'm going to be using is called Solar Paste, and it's a translucent paste that has this beautiful shimmer to it. The color I'm using is Overheated, and so it will have this kind of orange hue to it when you see it in the light, but it really shines when you add it on top of ink or mix ink into it. So I went ahead and added that dark brown layer of ink, and now we're going to add the stencil paste. So you can see there it almost looks white and has an iridescent shimmer to it, but when it's applied onto dark paper or dark ink, it will take in some of that color and it will create such a beautiful shine. I'm so excited for you to see it up close once this stencil paste is dry. So I'm just using a palette knife to pick up the stencil paste and apply it to my stencil, and then using my large scraper to make sure I have a nice even amount throughout my whole entire panel. I did wipe off the ink as you saw before I started adding the stencil paste, but because this is such a light color, it will pick up some of the ink, so I'm trying to be very sparing and not have a ton of leftover stencil paste because I'm not going to put it back into my jar. I love a good stencil reveal, so let's peel off this stencil off the grip mat and you can see how pretty this is looking so far. Even at this phase where the stencil paste is still pretty white and opaque, it looks so beautiful, but wait until you see when it's dry later. I'm going to go ahead and set that aside, and then I'm going to go quickly clean off my stencil and my grip mat, and we're going to start fresh here, and now it's time for some stamping. I'm picking out different images from, like I said, the Autumn Wreath and Fall Jar stamp sets. Definitely need that wreath, and I'm gently laying it into my MISTI because I want to make sure that I don't distort the stamp at all and it will fit perfectly in its coordinating die when I cut it out later. Of course, need that jar and that awesome little pumpkin design. It's going to be kind of the sticker or image that's going to be on my jar when I'm assembling everything together. I also love the moth, and I picked a bunch of different leaves and flowers from both sets and the tag and bow. I'm stamping all these images with an alcohol marker friendly brown ink. Now it's a little too light for my taste of how I'm going to color this card, but I'm going to show you what I do when I don't like the ink or if I'm coloring and I cover too much of the ink, and that's why I love the MISTI for this technique. So I stamped all my images in that light brown, and I'm just going to close up my MISTI. I'm not going to put my stamps away. We're going to use those again in just a few minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and just set that aside. Let me zoom in here so you can see my coloring. I'm going to just quickly go through the different color combinations. This is Ohuhu art markers, and I prefer Honolulu and even more prefer the bees. So I have a brush and nib dual marker set for my coloring. And for the light browns, I'm using E240 and E220, and that's kind of my go-to combination for this light colored brown. I use it a lot for critters and obviously for leaves for the fall. And I'm going to have two different color browns here, so I'm just going to add this where I think the lighter brown should be in different leaves, the stem of my pumpkin, and the part of my acorns, the actual acorn bit. And then I'm going to choose some really regal jewel tone colors. So for this purple color, I'm using R350, and that's going to be the little berries that are peeking out behind my pumpkin, the ribbon that will be on my jar, and what I think are thistles, if I had to guess, in the wreath. But obviously use your imagination and color how you'd like. But that was the darker tone, and now I'm using R340 to be the lighter tone between the two. I do a lot of my coloring in sets of 2 to 3 because these images are mostly pretty small. I'm just going to be using two colors, a dark and a light. For the more pinky red purple, is that a color? Pinky red purple. My flowers, I'm using R290 as the darker color, and then I'm going to bring in R280 as the lighter color. Now these two have a little bit of more of a difference between the two shades than I normally prefer, so I'm just going to really ink up that dark shadow line and try to blend it out as best as I can to create a nice fade between the two colors. For my more bluey green, I'm going to be adding two different types of green to my images. So again, more of a blue green, and I'm starting with G7 and I'm coloring in the leaves. I'm not going to color in the corn. I'm going to use a more yellowy green for that color, but quite a few of the leaves I'm using this kind of more teal green, and the lighter color is G5. And again, just adding in color and trying to blend in between the darker and the lighter so it creates a nice, pretty, mostly seamless look between the two. Now for the more yellowy green, I'm starting with GY2, and that's going to be the color of a lot more of my leaves as well as the green leaves of my corn on the cobs. And the lighter color is GY5. Again, picking up that ink from the darker shade and doing my best to blend them together. I don't mind more of a, colored in look versus a seamless blending, but definitely, follow whatever techniques you like, or maybe you prefer colored pencils or a different type of coloring medium. For the yellow, I'm doing YR1 and YR33. I'm definitely going more of a brown yellow than like a bright yellow. The second brown I'm using is the darker brown, and it's E460 and E450, and that's going to be the tops of my acorns. Next, I'm going to color in my pumpkin and my mushroom tops, and this is going to be more of a redishy orange color, and I'm using E080 as the darker color and E060 as the lighter color. And like I said, since it's more of an orangey red, I'm coloring in my pumpkin with this color and the tops of my mushrooms because I love like a redishy looking mushroom. I will color in the stems of my mushrooms with the light brown color combination that I started with, and then my moth is colored in with the light brown, dark brown, and yellow colors. I did it last because I wasn't really sure how I wanted to color it in, but once I looked up some photos of moths, I figured those were the best colors for my little moth. I wanted my jar to have kind of a ceramic jar feel, so I'm going to be using my yellow grays for coloring it in. And I'm starting with YG080 as the darkest, and I'm leaving a white edge because I want my jar to look white but to have a nice fall colored shadow. And the next color I'm going to use is YG040, and just like I've been coloring everything else, I'm trying to pick up some of that darker color from the alcohol ink that I laid down as the darker shade with my more lighter shade, and to blend those colors out. So just kind of flicking or painting with the brush, as you could kind of see some of that color out from the darker parts of the jar. And I'm going to bring that out even more with a warm gray, WG 0.5. And the reason why I'm bringing in this third color is because this is such a large image. I really want to make sure that there's a good blend. And then finally, I'm taking my colorless blender and completely coloring in my jar. This will soften the darkest shadows a little bit and just try to have a nice blend between all of those different shades to fill in my jar. And that will dry back as the alcohol evaporates. And I use that same warm gray color to just color in my tag. One simple, nice color. So now that all the coloring is done, look how beautiful these colors are together. I love it. I'm going to grab my Misty, and like I said, I didn't move my stamps. And this is the scary part. Don't get me wrong, I was very nervous, but because we used our Misty and I'm putting my paper in the same spot, which is that lower left-hand corner, I'm coming back in with a darker brown, and this is VersaFine Clair in Pinecone, which is one of my go-to colors for brown, especially with stamping and sentiments. And I'm going to lay my Misty door down. I'm making sure it looks like it lines up perfectly before really pressing it down, and it does. And I just love the look of this really vibrant dark brown color on top of my alcohol marker coloring. Isn't it beautiful? I just think it really makes all of the images pop. And the reason why I didn't start with this color is because VersaFine Clairs are not generally alcohol marker friendly. They're more watercolor friendly. So I didn't want to start with that, but I wanted it to be the finishing look. So that's why I love my Misty, and I'm able to do that when you have a stamping platform like that. Here's just a quick look at those marker caps again. Feel free to pause and take a screenshot if you also use Ohuhu art markers. And then I'm going to use those coordinating dies to cut out all of my images for the two stamp sets. By now my background is dry, and here you can see how pretty that orange looks on the wood grain paper, and it's not translucent because it picked up some of that brown ink behind it. And I'm going to get my A2 card base ready. So just using a bone folder to really push on that crease on the fold of my card. And I'm going to use my big old tape runner here to add adhesive to the back of this design. I'm trying really hard not to press too hard into my glass mat because while it is dry, I am an impatient crafter, and I just want to make sure I'm not squishing any of that beautiful design on my card. Once I have that background down, I'm going to do kind of a dry run and lay out all of my images so I can kind of narrow down how I want my card to look. And here is a quick look at how I'm going to adhere everything down. I'm very happy with this layout. I'm going to start with the wreath because I'm going to just use some liquid adhesive to glue that to my card base. It's going to be the very back of the card, so I don't really want to add too much dimension to make my card super thick. So this is just going to be glued right down. And I like using liquid glue when I'm adhering a flat image to a textured cardstock. So not only does it have a wood grain impression in this cardstock, but all of that stenciling creates more texture. And I'm using the grid on my mat to help me get that as centered as possible. I am going to add this pumpkin image to my jar. Like I said, I wanted it to look kind of like a label or a design on my jar. So just gluing that right on. I could have also stamped it into the jar and colored it, but that's fine. I think it looks pretty, kind of like a sticker on my jar. I'm going to pop up my jar, so I'm putting some foam adhesive, and then I realized I should probably glue down my leaves that are going to be tucked into the jar first. So I'm using liquid adhesive at the bottom of the leaves that will be hidden behind the edge of my jar. And then I'm using some small foam squares to pop up the top of my leaves. So it will look like it's kind of coming out of the jar and leaning towards the card receiver. So just adding my jar to help me with placement, and I'll tuck in those green leaves. And then I will repeat this process for my little brown leaves duo. So again, adding foam adhesive to the top of the leaves and then bringing in that liquid glue to glue the bottom of the leaves. So just using that jar again and the grid mat to make sure my jar is centered and tucking in those brown leaves. My flower will end up sitting on top, so I'm going to go ahead and finish adding the foam adhesive to the back side of my jar. These are larger squares since it is a larger image. I peeled off all of the release paper from the adhesive and gluing this down to the center of the card and doing my best to leave the same amount of space under the jar as I have above my wreath. I want to add my tag next, so when my flower is added, it will, if it overlaps with the tag and bow, I will already have those on. I'm going to use liquid adhesive where the tag overlaps my jar, and then I added a little foam square to where it will overlap on the background, so that way there is stability. And same thing with my bow, adding, it's kind of similar to how I added my leaves, except I'm just adding foam adhesive to the parts where it will touch the background, and then liquid adhesive where it will overlap with images that already are popped up with foam adhesive. And then I will add that flower now that everything is glued down, and I ended up, I think, not overlapping at all with the bow and the tag, but I just wasn't sure how I was going to place it in exactly, so I wanted to make sure everything was down and that flower went in next. And finally, my cute little moth, I'm going to add it more towards the top right of the wreath since I added those leaves and flower details more towards the bottom left. I like when my images have a bit of a balance to them, so I'm going to add it to the other side. And once that's done, that will finish off my card. I do like adding white highlights to my images, so I'm grabbing a jelly roll in size 10, and I'm just going to add some highlights to my images. I don't really have a light source in mind, so I'm just adding I'm just adding the white to the color of my images, just where I think they'll look nice. Here is a close-up of this fall and autumn themed card. I hope these colors inspire you today. I was all about pastel for Halloween, but now I'm thinking nice, rich, regal jewel tones for Thanksgiving. Let me know what you think of this color combination and what are your go-to colors for fall and Thanksgiving cards. Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll click like, and if you're new here, I hope you'll subscribe and come back. As always, you can find everything I use down below in the description box. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bye!